Hello and welcome to another video and podcast from fantasyfootballscout.co.uk. My name is David and today we are going to be continuing in our series of FPL Scout Reports where we have a look at players who have joined the Premier League, perhaps joined one Premier League team, having left another, or in some instances a new manager as well. And it is in the middle of those three categories that we operate today because we are going to have a look at one Harvey Barnes, who has left recently relegated Leicester to join Newcastle as they continue their transfer spree of the summer. £38 million on a 5-year deal for this man, and the fans of that club are already very, very excited. Included in that is, of course, Ed, one of our scouts here at Scout, and he's already got him in his team. And he's in the 6.5 million bracket, which is nice to see because he scored 13 goals last season, and actually that price feels relatively kind, and a team that we know can score goals, and a team that of course is going to be playing in the Champions League, and so he's immediately on the fantasy radar based purely on that price. And it's due diligence really that has brought us to this place where we want to see what impact he's going to have on FPL. What does it mean for other Newcastle attackers as well? Will we be owning any of those players this season? All of those questions we are going to have a look at. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Fantasy Football Scout YouTube channel if you've been enjoying these scout reports. And of course, don't forget to hit that bell notification to make sure that you don't miss anything else. Now, before I continue, I do just have to remind you guys that now is the best time this season to sign up for Fantasy Football Scout membership. You can save up to 30% at the pre-season prices. Among the many things that you can get hold of with your membership, many of you know the details already, is of course access to the members only articles on site. One of those is Neil's scout report on Harvey Barnes. So I'll be able to go through a lot of information today, but if you want even more depth, head to the website and use your membership to read Neil's article. Neil, the editor of the site, famously a Newcastle fan, and he is one of many of the Toon Army very excited to have Harvey Barnes around. So big thank you to Neil as well for helping with research in this video. But yes, let's jump straight into it. Harvey Barnes coming to Newcastle. At first, I kind of looked at that and was a bit like, oh, okay, cool. Another winger at Newcastle. Okay. But the more and more I look at this, the more I'm quite actually excited about what that's going to mean for their attack. In many ways, he's gone under the radar as a fantasy asset in recent years. And when you consider that Leicester were relegated last season and some of the numbers he put up, I do think in this Newcastle attack he can be very dangerous. And among the people excited about this transfer, not just the fans, not just the Fantasy Premier League managers, but Harvey himself and the manager at Newcastle. So yeah, Harvey says, I think it's an attacker's dream to come to a team like this. It's high-paced, it's physically demanding, but you can see the rewards of that with the chances and the goals scored. So I think he thinks he's basically going to suit the style, which makes a lot of sense. Whenever I've watched him play, he does give it quite a lot of gusto, which is going to be very useful for this attack. And then Eddie Howe himself says, with any attacking player, you're looking for a product firstly, so goals and assists. You want him to support the team ethic and have an understanding of how we try to be successful, with everyone pitching in and contributing both in and out of possession. I think we saw today, and what he's referring to there is Harvey Barnes' debut for Newcastle in the pre-season against Aston Villa. I think we saw today he has the athleticism we require. There were some really sharp moments and bursts of speed, and that cut-in, that's probably his trademark, that type of finish. We're very excited about what he can bring. I've heard he's an incredible character, so I think he'll tick all those boxes about being really good around the training ground and wanting to improve and get better. So already good signs coming out of Newcastle about him. And yeah, I mean, as I said, going back over his FPL history, I'd actually forgotten how useful this guy was a number of years ago. We did a scout report on Mason Mount recently. It's a little bit like that, really. Someone who was a little bit more focused on a number of years ago and crept under the radar last year. But the difference with Mount is that Mount dropped off the radar last year because he wasn't having a very good campaign. But actually, 13 goals for Barnes was incredible because actually only 5 other FPL midfielders scored more than that. And all of them are now priced 8 million or higher, and he somehow has managed to end up with a price drop. It's gone down to 6.5 million, having started last season at 7. And again, I kept looking back at the numbers from previous seasons, and I got to be honest, I don't know why I haven't owned him more often, to be honest. I think when he first came to the Premier League, he'd been at Leicester for a long time. He had some loans elsewhere, and when he first was playing for Leicester in the top flight, I did feel like he was a bit of a volume shooter who maybe wasn't always necessarily finding the target, but clearly he's improved on that in recent years. So let's go through some of these campaigns in a bit more detail. So 2017-18, just the 3 points from 0 starts, 3 sub-appearances, 8 minutes played. So that seems fair enough. He was a 4.5 million midfielder back then. But then 18-19, he got 43 points from 11 starts, 5 sub-appearances, 1 goal, 3 assists, and a bonus point of 5.5. So slowly edging into the team, but it was really 19-20 where he had a breakout season. It was his highest ever at that time, 133 points from 24 starts, 12 sub-appearances, 6 goals, 10 assists, 9 bonus as a 6 million midfielder. So 16 attacking returns there. Very, very impressive. 2020-21, a little bit of regression, but still 14 attacking returns. So he had 22 starts, 9 goals, 5 assists, 13 bonus points this time as a 7 million midfielder. And then his trend just went up and up. So 21-22 up to 137 points this time. 6 goals, 12 assists, so that's 18 attacking returns in 24 starts. And then incredibly, the season that Leicester got relegated was actually Harvey Barnes' all-time top FPL scoring season. 138 points this time from 32 starts, 2,709 minutes played, 13 goals, 2 assists. And so interestingly enough, actually slightly fewer attacking returns and slightly fewer bonus points. I think in the end, what helped him just edge past that 137, which is previous personal best, was just was more appearance points. He has had a few injuries over the years, and last year was the year where he was at his fittest, and that helped push him over the line. But either way, looking at those stats, it's at least 14 attacking returns in every season since 2019-20. And so for him to come in at 6.5 million, especially after getting his highest ever score last time out, get a 0.5 million drop, it's incredible stuff, really. And yeah, in terms of how that compared to the rest of the league, it gets even more impressive. So 13 goals for him. And then the only FPL midfielders to find the back of the net more often than Barnes in 22-23, Saka with 14, Martinelli with 15, Ødegaard with 15, Rashford with 17, Salah with 19. And when you look at the prices of those players now, they feel in line with what they've done before. So Saka is now 8.5, Martinelli's 8 million, Ødegaard's 8.5, Rashford's 9 million, and Salah is 12.5. And Harvey Barnes is 6.5. And obviously, he's come in to Newcastle, been priced specifically as a Newcastle player because he had disappeared from FPL with Leicester being relegated. So you can't even, point to the Leicester factor within that because he's joined an attack that can score a lot of goals. And so, without wanting to make it sound like I'm criticising the pricing, I'm very happy with it, to be honest, because I think at some point in the season I'm going to be owning him because that price could be incredible value because arguably his attacking potential just went up. So there we are. But where is he going to fit in at Newcastle? That, of course, is what we always like to have a look at as well. And this one's actually quite a simple one because, he's normally been featuring on the left-hand side of an attacking front three for Leicester, or perhaps on the left-hand side of a 3 behind a 1. But either way, in the 4-3-3 system that we see at Newcastle, I think he's going straight into that left-hand side. It does look as if Alan Saint-Maximin is leaving the club, so that's one less winger to have to worry about. Of course, they've got Champions League football as well, so a bit of strength and depth doesn't do any harm. We're looking at a situation where we've probably got 4 players fighting out for 2 wing spots, and that's if Howe sticks with the 4-3-3. And he's probably, Harvey Barnes, going to be competing with Anthony Gordon on the left-hand side, with Almiron and Murphy probably competing with each other to start on the right-hand side predominantly, but Gordon can play on both sides. And so the predicted lineup we've got on the screen at the moment, which has been put together by Neil, who not only is the best guesser of a Premier League team in the world, in my opinion, also very knowledgeable on Newcastle, with that being his hometown club. He's actually got Barnes and Gordon. And so that could mean perhaps that Almiron doesn't feature so much, and Jacob Murphy is probably of the 4 the least likely to be starting. Although I do think the way that he's managed to stay relevant in this Newcastle team in the last few years has been very impressive. But of the 4, I have to say I think Barnes is the one with the most proven Premier League goal-scoring record at the very least. And so, yeah, it does seem like he's just going to drop straight into that. There's a few other mitigating factors, of course. Joe Linton had a little bit of time on the left wing in 22-23, and then Isak was there as well when Howe was trying to find ways to get Isak and Wilson in the same team, for example. And he did okay-ish against the teams that weren't so good at defending that channel, but for the most part that did allow Wilson to outscore him towards the end of the campaign. So yeah, there's the other considerations to be made, but largely I think we can be fairly confident that we're going to see Barnes play on that particular part of the pitch quite regularly for Newcastle in the Premier League. But it's not just about where he's going to play. We do need to compare him with everybody else in that Newcastle midfield to see whether or not he truly is the best Newcastle midfielder coming in. Well, this one's actually fairly simple as well, because when we look at last season, we compare all of the Newcastle midfielders to the points that they scored. The only one who outperformed him was Almiron, funnily enough, actually, from fewer minutes, although he did have that real purple patch right in the middle of the campaign and then wasn't doing quite so well either side of that. So 158 points for Almiron, 138 for Barnes, and then that puts him ahead of Willock on 123, Joelinton on 115, Gumaraj on 107, Longstaff on 93, and the list goes on and on and on. What this really confirms to us, to be honest, is that finally there may actually be a route into the Newcastle attack that doesn't have to be one of those strikers, because the midfield at Newcastle for quite some time, with the exception of Almiron in the sort of first third-ish of the season, has been a bit of just tumbleweeds blowing past. Hasn't been too many people worth considering, but now we do finally have a route in for someone who scored 13 goals, 2 assists. Almiron actually got 11 goals and 4 assists, so it was actually the same number of attacking returns, and even though Barnes scored more goals, there was still more total FPL points for Almiron, which actually just basically came down to bonus again. This is something that is worth just quickly talking about with Barnes, is that he had a massive aversion to bonus points last season and has historically had a bit of an aversion to bonus points on the whole when you consider how many goals he has scored. And it does come back to that little bit we were talking about at the beginning about him being a volume shooter and not necessarily always ensuring that his shots are on target. It's just a hit and hope, which doesn't have to be a bad thing. That's not criticism of him as a player, because, Mohamed Salah, when he first arrived in the Premier League, was basically the same thing. He scored lots of goals from shooting lots of times, and for quite some time didn't get much bonus because shots off target massively damaged the bonus ratings for players. And so it does seem as if we may still have a little bit of that with Barnes, but that doesn't have to necessarily be an issue, because if he's the one most likely to score goals in this Newcastle midfield, I think I'd still rather have him over any of the other options. Almiron, the possible exception if he could get back to that goal scoring form of last season, but it seems unlikely because it did seem like a bit of a purple patch rather than signs of true consistency, because he actually famously is a player who's very good at underperforming his XG. So, of those two, even if Almiron was able to start games in a world where Barnes is around, I think I'd probably still prefer Barnes. But the question is, it's not just about those midfielders. We do have to compare Harvey Barnes with those two strikers at Newcastle because, they were very popular towards the end of last season with the double game weeks coming in. Some of us had Wilson, some of us had Isak. Some of us, myself included, went for both just to avoid having to make that decision. It didn't work out as well as I'd like, and I should have been more brave on captaining Wilson than captaining Isak in the double game weeks that they had. But yeah, because they were so at the forefront of that, we have to compare with Barnes. And, there had been this real commitment to 3-5-2 when the game launched, but as pre-season has wound on and we've started to see a few more forwards looking good in the pre-season, and we've got a 4.5 million midfielder in Nakamba now, which does actually facilitate a 3-4-3. I think it's worth considering where we can cover some of the teams that we're excited about or some of the midfielders we're excited about up front. Now, I'm always nervous of using the C word, the word cover, because, we buy players in FPL, we don't buy teams. And so the best player can't necessarily always be covered by someone else in the same team. But the reason I mention it is because actually, compared with Barnes, I actually still prefer Wilson and Isak, I think, based on what we saw at the end of last season. Now, Barnes' stats for the whole campaign for goals, they do look good. How Leicester finished the campaign obviously wasn't great, and so that's perhaps a mitigating factor here, but the sheer difference in underlying stats between Wilson, Isak and Barnes in the final 12 game weeks of last season, as I said, I think that does shift the needle towards the forwards. And so we'll run through some of those numbers now. Barnes, despite being a midfielder, is not necessarily more creative. He is more of a shooter, as we've already said. So in the last 12 game weeks of last season, with 795 minutes, which is actually more than Wilson, and about 200 less than Isak, 6 chances created. Well, both Wilson and Isak created 9 each, Wilson, of course, played fewer minutes. Then big chances created, 3, same as Wilson, and 1 more than Isak. So, that's quite useful. Sometimes when you're a winger, you do end up creating, an attacking one who's like an inside forward, a bit like a Salah. You end up creating more bigger chances than those who are less forward-like, because you just have the ball in more dangerous positions. But the volume is clearly there a little bit more with the key passes with the forwards. But when it comes to the goal threat, the gap is even bigger. So 16 shots in the box for Barnes in the last 12 game weeks, 26 for Wilson, 27 for Isak. And then with big chances, 5 for Barnes, 6 for Isak, and 15 for Wilson. And Wilson was actually in the top 5 for this stat for this particular period. It was also in the top 5 for shots on target, 15 for him. Same for Isak, that's 5 more than Barnes. And whilst Isak is ahead of Barnes, having played more minutes, so that seems fair enough. Wilson was playing fewer minutes, and that's because he was sort of being used as a bit of an impact substitute. I know that put some people off him. I still think that doesn't actually have to be a damaging thing, because he was actually performing as one of the best statistical players in the Premier League, despite not starting every game and getting the attacking returns. And so all you were really missing out on was that additional minutes played point for playing a whole hour. It didn't really make much difference, and sometimes he was doing better as a substitute as he was starting games, which was is a bit flipped and makes him a bit of an enigma. But the point is that Wilson clearly the better player here. In terms of how the last season finished. And we've talked about those minutes, the minutes per XGI we'll talk about in just a second, because expected goal involvement, it was, again, the comparison's not really close. So Barnes had an expected goal involvement in the last 12 game weeks of last season, 2.82, Isak 5.77, Wilson 9.59. Yes, there's penalties involved in that, but we probably don't expect Barnes to be involved in them. So actually that is, it's not one of these situations where we should extract the penalties from these players because, well, they're involved in taking the penalties and Barnes probably won't be. The gap in those numbers, not necessarily influenced by the minutes here either, because when we look at minutes per expected goal involvement, Barnes is the worst as well. So Wilson on 70.4, Isak on 183, and then Barnes on 281.9. And Wilson with a much higher goal conversion rate as well, 37.9%. Isak's a little bit worse, 19.4%, and Barnes is 22.7%. But broadly, what that shows really is that the forward players are better. Now, of course, there is a difference in price here. Barnes is going to save you a whole million against Isak. He's going to save you 1.5 against Wilson. But in many ways, I'm sort of looking at the way that our teams are set up at the start of this season. There's a lot of options in the 6.5 million bracket. At Brighton, for example, if Chelsea start well, we've got Sterling at 7, Mudryk at 6.5. Spurs as well, very interested to see how they start the campaign. I'm probably going to own Maddison at 7.5 at some point. And Burmo's very popular at 6.5. For example. So there is a lot of options in midfield, and it seems hard to make room for Barnes if the comparison with the Newcastle strikers isn't looking so good, especially when the striker slots, there seems to be a little bit more room for those because, when we look at the fixtures in just a second, switching from a Watkins to a Wilson or a Jesus to a Wilson, for example, that seems a switch I'd be a bit more inclined to make than to give up one of those precious midfield slots where there is a lot of competition for very few places. But let's talk about those fixtures, because that is probably the most important factor here, because Newcastle actually start the season in a very challenging place when it comes to those fixtures. And so my conclusion from this is that I don't want Harvey Barnes in my Game Week 1 team, but that doesn't mean that I don't want him or one of those forwards later on. So let's have a look at how they start the campaign then. Newcastle, in the first 6 game weeks, they rank in the bottom half of our season ticker, which you can access via the Fantasy Football Scout members area. Between game weeks 1 and 6, it's Villa at home, Man City away, Liverpool at home, Brighton away, Brentford at home, Sheffield United away. And so they are very tricky in the first 4, although they do get much nicer when we go from game week 6 to 14, when they are actually second best on the season ticker for attacking potential, behind only Aston Villa. So take a look at this run of games. Sheffield United away, Burnley at home, West Ham away, Palace at home, Wolves away, Arsenal at home, Bournemouth away, Chelsea at home, Man United at home. So it's towards the back end of that, not looking so nice. But especially between 6 and 12, they're fixtures that it's worth having someone. And so it may be a case of having a look at what your team is looking like when we get to game week 6. Do you have an opening in midfield? Well, you might do, because Arsenal's fixtures get a little bit tougher when we get to this point. They're top of the season ticker for attacking potential in the first 4, for example, but between game week 6 and 14, they're in the bottom 5 because they face Spurs, Bournemouth away, Man City at home, Chelsea away, and then they've also got Newcastle away in that run. They've got Brentford away in that run, and they've got some nice home fixtures: Sheffield United, Burnley, and Wolves, for example. So it's going to be tricky navigating that, but you might want to perhaps downgrade and how much you're invested in the Arsenal attack potentially once we get to that point. Newcastle is going to be a good alternative route, and this is what I meant about those switches. Do you want to switch from a Saka to a Barnes? Well, maybe you might want to free up some cash, but actually a switch from Jesus to a Wilson or an Isak could be worth looking at as well. And the other thing here, really, because as I said, my conclusion here is not at the beginning of the season for either of these attackers. It's a wait and see. We also need to have a work out what the European commitments are going to look like for Newcastle. They're not going to kick in until game week 5. They're in the Champions League for the first time in about 2 decades. I think it was 2003-04 the last time they were playing European football. Very exciting for them. Very happy to see them back on that stage. But what that means for the squad does remain to be seen. We didn't see Eddie Howe rotate massively last season, although it did get a little bit tricky to predict which of those forwards were going to play, and that seems like the foundation for some concerns about what that could mean for rotation when the Champions League is around. Is Wilson going to be the Premier League striker and Isak the Champions League one? Is he going to be very situational and play both of them in one Premier League game and then only one of them the next time based on who the opponent is? Of course, Isak can play on the left-hand side and did do at the end of last season. Does that mean that maybe Barnes doesn't start every game for the same sort of reasons? Is he going to be situational based on the opponent? Is there advantages to having a centre forward play on the left wing versus someone like Barnes who's more of an inside forward, for example? So lots of things up in the air about Newcastle. We really do need more data on what their season is going to look like, and it's handy that their fixtures are quite poor at the start of the season because we're not really going to be missing out on much. We're not exposed to any kind of effective ownership problems by not investing in the likes of Barnes, Wilson and Isak. But with those two strikers, especially Wilson as well, the numbers that they were posting at the end of last season do, I think, put them in the conversation for who you would switch to when you perhaps lean into that fixture swing around game week 6. So it's worth keeping an eye on what they do in pre-season, worth keeping an eye on how they perform in the first 5 game weeks, and obviously keep an eye on Barnes as well, and then make a decision beyond that point. That's what I'm going to be doing. And just a quick reminder that a lot of the things you've seen here are in the Fantasy Football Scout members area, such as the season ticker and some of the numbers we went through. So get your membership sorted ahead of the new campaign, save up to 30% on those pre-season prices. Like this video and subscribe to the Fantasy Football Scout YouTube channel if you've been enjoying this content, and hit that bell notification as well so you don't miss a thing this pre-season. Well, with that, I will leave you fine folks to enjoy the rest of your tinkering, and I will see you next time.